welcome to this first architecture lecture of the semester, although we've already had planning lectures, and next week we'll have a landscape lecture, so we have an excellent series. This semester, I encourage you to come back as often as we invite you. As we are early in this year's series, also I want to remind everyone that following the presentation, we'll have a few moments for audience questions, so please just remain seated and please ask a good question. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Adib Cúre and Carie Penabad, founders of the Miami-based architectural practice, CÚRE Penabad. Adib Cúre's research focuses on Latin American urbanism and architecture, most notably the mapping of informal cities throughout the global South. He's an associate professor in practice at the University of Miami School of Architecture and has taught at Yale University as the Louis Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor of Architectural Design, Northeastern University, and the Boston Architectural Center. Carie Penabad is a full professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture and was formerly Associate Dean of Research and Director of the undergraduate program. She has taught in a wide variety of institutions, and in 2013, along with Adib, she was appointed the Louis Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor at Yale University, where I first learned about their work and also saw their pedagogy in action. Her publications include Marion Manley, Miami's first woman architect, and Call to Order, Sustaining Simplicity in Architecture. Since 2013, Carie has hosted On Cities, an international radio show and podcast dedicated to the design of our cities and how the built environment shapes the quality of our lives. Together, their designs reflect their own diverse cultural influences of Colombia, Cuba, and the United States, where they both studied at the University of Miami School of Architecture and at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. In addition to their built work, Carie and Adib are working on a forthcoming book entitled Made in Miami, Hecho in Miami, a bilingual guidebook to the city's buildings and spaces. Since founding CÚRE Penabad in 2001, they have amassed an impressive body of speculative and built work, including public spaces, corporate headquarters, private residences, mixed-use towers, and master plans. The firm's work has received numerous design awards, including more than 24 American Institute of Architecture awards, local and national preservation awards, and in 2021, the prestigious Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, a competition that recognizes individuals with a distinct design voice and a significant body of realized work. I first came to know the work of CÚRE Penabad through their drawings. Often characterized by the elegance of the one-point perspective, intense color fields, and subtle textures, their drawing style conveys an aspirational architecture, one where cultural sensitivities and environmental realities merge. Their built work in kind reflects this eclecticism. They work between regional styles, vernacular and global inspirations, and climate realities. In their own words, which I loved and I had to quote, quote, "The work challenges the double tyranny of program and diagram that have come to dominate the design process today, relying on a broader understanding of history and typology for a looser and therefore more sustainable fit between program and form," end quote. Tonight, I'm most excited about how this work offers an intense commitment to architecture's disciplinary and practical concerns through a directed use and attention to material practices, cultural conventions, and progressive pedagogy. Please join me in welcoming Carie and Adib.
Thank you. I'm not Adib. So I'm Carie, and Adib will be seated here in the audience, and we're happy to have a conversation at the very end. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Ohio, and it's been beautiful to walk this city. So we would like to first and foremost thank Director Ann Peddleton-Julian and Ashley Bingham and Eric Herman for the kind invitation to speak with you today. More than a lecture, we would like to share the story of our practice and some of the central themes that guide our work. The work presented here tonight is really the collective effort of a talented team of individuals without whom the work of the firm would not exist, and to them we are immensely grateful. So in preparing for this presentation, we came across a quote: "Designing means working with one's biography. One does not see things as they are. One sees them through the person that one is." We began to reflect on how our own biographies and personal histories weigh in on our attitudes towards architecture and practice. Both Adib and I come from the Caribbean, and our ancestry lies in the colonial cities of Cartagena de Indias in Colombia and Havana and Santiago in Cuba, respectively. These historic cities that are perched on the sea were built with the porous oolitic rock that shapes this region of the world. And this material reality is made manifest in the architecture with its thick, heavy masonry walls and its layers of porches and shutters that both protect and filter from the intense tropical light. This assemblage, even today, and amidst such a fragile and unstable political situation of the region, displays the permanence of these elements and the effort of weight and solidity that imbues these cities with a sense of resilience and continuity. By contrast, Miami, where we have spent much of our adult lives, is a very young city. With little over 100 years since its founding, Miami lies in a precarious line between the sea and the swamp. Largely built after the Second World War, Miami has replaced most of its historic architecture and in turn erased much of its origins. Today, it is feverishly building an expanding contemporary city along Biscayne Bay, defined by an architecture largely of thinness, with glazed and stuccoed buildings that are sealed off from much of the environment that defines this often magical landscape. In many ways, Miami is a discontinuous city whose constant search for the new produces an amnesia about the past. Could it be that displaced from our own origins and witness to the effects of time on these historic cities versus our own, we've always been drawn to search for what is fundamental and resonant in architecture, those elements that have the capacity to withstand the test of time. Our search for origins is guided by a process of distillation that seeks to reduce a work of architecture to its most fundamental aspects, aspects that have the capacity to endure and to respond to the specificities of place and culture. As in the process of making wine, distillation extracts the essential characteristics, resulting in an outcome that could not be further reduced without being compromised. Some of our most powerful encounters with the search for origins in architecture have come through our study of vernacular architecture. Throughout the world, both at the scale of a building and at the scale of the city. According to Webster's dictionary, the term vernacular refers to the use of a language or a dialect that is native to a region, country, rather than a foreign language. The vernacular is always linked to the particulars of a given culture, and yet, what does this mean today when we coexist in a globally interconnected world? Interestingly, the vernacular has always moved between the local and the global. The vernacular addresses the basic human need for shelter and enclosure through fundamental architectural responses that are not guided by novelty, but rather by wisdom, the wisdom of the ages transmitted through architectural form and made manifest in the timeless elements of the floor, the wall, and the roof. In so doing, certain formal architectural expressions have arisen in regions that share similar cultures or climates, despite never having developed alongside one another. So how can we explain this? Perhaps we can refer to it as architectural common sense. Should we not raise our buildings when they are set on wet ground, or provide steeply sloped roofs in regions where it rains or it snows incessantly? We believe that the vernacular is not just linked to a historical past, but it is a generative grammar that incorporates modern buildings and cities, as well as the byproducts of mass culture. So for us, the vernacular includes the urban patterns seen here that define informal vernacular settlements, such as Las Flores along the northern coast of Barranquilla, Colombia, or the historic rural Cuban bohío, built from the natural materials of the surrounding landscape and meant to weather alongside it, or the contemporary pencil building type, which is unique to Tokyo, producing unbelievably thin urban buildings that are directly extruded atop of the historic 16th century planning, thus registering the urban grid of the origins of the city. In the end, the vernacular, both historically and also as part of contemporary culture, epitomizes the theme of distillation, as it searches for fundamental forms that always do more with less. And it is perhaps this interest that brings us to search for simplified, distilled forms in our own work. Many of the projects that I will present to you tonight rely on simple geometric forms for their architectural expression. This formal output is the result of multiple and complementary forces acting on the work that often results on the development of an architecture of restraint, where the range of materials and compositional moves are limited to a few carefully selected elements. The work is centered on the timeless building of cities and displays a commitment to the production of a whole that is always more than the sum of the parts. Tectonically, the work consistently develops an architecture of wall, often searching for an illusion of thickness where none exists, and drawing upon the traditions of a region, both in Miami and throughout Latin America, where the wall, and not the skeletal frame, is viewed as the primary means of architectural and structural expression. Seen in its totality, the work emerges from an understanding of architectural tradition interpreted in the broadest and most holistic sense, and it emerges from the notion that the discipline of architecture has a language and a grammar of form making, and that a contemporary practice can participate in a broader lineage or a connection to the origins of a distant past without feeling anxiety or nostalgia. So when Adib and I completed our studies at Harvard, we went on to work with our professors, Jorge Silvetti, Rodolfo Machado. Oftentimes this happens. I'm sure many of the faculty have done this as well. And several years later, we returned to Miami to take on teaching positions at the University of Miami and to start our own practice. So Miami, seen here, is at the center of this map. When viewed from the Northeast, Miami is often viewed as this exotic province. And I have to say, an extremely desirable province in the post-pandemic world. But when seen from Latin America, Miami is the capital. So the city is either at the edge or at the center, depending on your frame of reference. And as such, it's a place that's continuously reinventing itself. The first projects that we took on in the city were varied, and they took place in very different urban settings. We worked in the heart of suburbia, within the historic Garden City, and finally in the new burgeoning city. All distinctly different contexts that make up the complex patchwork that will define Miami. So this is the media image that is projected for Miami. I don't know if any of you have seen such an image, but it's an aerial view of the historic Art Deco district at dusk, with Biscayne Bay and the high-rise development of downtown and Brickell in the distance. This is a very alluring and attractive city with a dense urbanism that creates a vibrant urban environment that locals as well as tourists enjoy. But this is what most of Miami really looks like. Anybody want to visit? Okay. A city that dramatically expanded following World War II with an urbanism that was largely designed for the car. This is where our first project took place. On a suburban site adjacent to Southwest 8th Street, one of the primary east-west corridors in the city. And what you can see here is all of the elements that are typically associated with the suburban context. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of asphalt, cars, buildings set hundreds of feet from the street. You won't find a pedestrian within 3 miles of this site, basically. Everybody arrives by car and leaves by car. We were presented with an opportunity to work with a client that had an extremely limited budget in one of the less desirable places in the city, and where we were asked or tasked to design a single building to house this collection of men's suits. And you might ask, why would we take this on? We would take this on because we found a correspondence with a client that wanted to set themselves against this context, in sharp contrast to this context. And so we set out to attempt to do this. This was one of our first sketches where we designed this kind of taut box that had a prominent sign, which we'll display in a minute, and a series of sketches exploring the early ideas for the project. This section might tell the story in the clearest way. This is basically an area of strip malls, very low ceilings, not more than 8 feet 6 inches, drop acoustical tiles, very little natural daylight. So what did we want to do? We wanted to create a volume that was in sharp contrast to that reality. In this case, a double height volume that was naturally lit and that could press itself against the street rather than, being set amidst a parking lot. The sign became an important aspect of the project. This strip, 8th Street, actually has a number of memorable signs. We were displaced from the main street, so we had to find a way to give the building a presence on the main corridor. And so we produced this perpendicular sign that could be read from a distance. This is a diptych that describes both the front and the rear of the property. The front has really 2 moves, a depressed entry to protect you, basically from the rain, which is oftentimes the case in Miami, but also to produce a deep shadow and the kind of presence of thickness. And we had a sign, which again is meant to be registered from 8th Street. And then at the rear of the property, we are basically looking at all of the elements of the surrounding neighborhood. The standard casement window, the downspouts, the sort of eaves that protect some of the doorways, even the asphalt surfaces, but we tried to compose them in sort of extraordinary ways. So taking inspiration from the ordinary elements of the environment and recomposing them in a manner that would sort of stick in the mind. It's going so far as actually tinting the asphalt. This is an interior with an accompanying sketch. And finally, the building, upon completion, set against the kind of standard context of that suburban streetscape. Almost simultaneously with that project, we were approached to do a very small project, which we weren't sure if we were going to present to you today, but we thought for the sake of the argument of building architecture in the context of the city, it would be important. It took place within the historic context of Coral Gables, which is Miami's great garden city, developed in the 1920s by a developer and poet by the name of George Merrick. Miami has extremely little historic architecture, and what remains is under threat by extreme development pressures, now more than ever. We believe that the richest cities find a way to both grow while preserving the vestiges of the past that connects us to our history. And so for this reason, we took on the project. The scale of the project is extremely modest. After all, it's the restoration of a single dwelling. And here, unlike the previous project, we sought to research and to restore. Our goal was to be anonymous and simply bring the house back to life. This is not something that you're often taught to do in schools of architecture, because the desire is always to make your mark, to leave your signature. This project taught us that not all projects are intended to do this, and when restoring historic buildings, a more discreet and even silent hand can be more powerful in the long run. So the third project in the early work was a commission in the new city within a neighborhood called the Design District. It's an 18-block area in the city just north of downtown that was largely developed by a single developer, which is a phenomena that is quite common in Miami today. Originally, we were commissioned to create a very small kiosk for an empty lot in the neighborhood. However, we felt that the site had far greater potential, in part because Miami is a city that has very little public open space. This is not surprising because it's a city that developed predominantly after the war. And so really the detached single-family urbanism and the backyard became more important than the spaces that we collectively gather. And so per capita, we have a far less public open space than comparable cities like New York or Boston. So this was the site as it was presented to us. In the Miami manner, it was an asphalt parking lot, but it had the vestige of a series of oak trees that were 100 years old. And they were the last remaining oak trees in this area of the neighborhood. And so ultimately what we wanted to do was frame this landscape and create the first public space of the district. This is a plan showing you the project. I will really concentrate for the purposes of this presentation on the lower half of the image where we created a plaza with a liner building. This was a project done in conjunction with KVA Architects with a new street and a series of infill buildings to the north. The street was introduced because the blocks in this particular region of the city are very, very long. And so in order to promote greater pedestrian activity, we subdivided the block with this kind of pedestrian walkway and then created this corner plaza at the lower right of the image. So this is the project soon after it was completed. And in essence, it created a liner building that would provide two fronts to the space. And it erected the asphalt surfaces and basically lined it with thick oolitic limestone, which is the porous rock on which Miami is built. And this is a stone that was used historically in the public realm, and it connects us to both our history and our geology. The surfaces of the plaza were developed with a small mosaic tiled surface. And this was influenced by our travels throughout the tropical world, where the colored tiled surfaces were able to withstand the bleaching rays of the sun and cleanse themselves against the harsh weather and the rain so typical of our place in the world. And I was just told by Ashley that you haven't had rain in like 6 weeks. I need you all to come down to Miami. We're up to our knees in rain right now, or down to Miami. We need to get you some of the rain. The murals also elaborated on the theme of art, display, and design that were characteristic of both the Design District and later the adjacent Wynwood neighborhood. At close glance, the tiled surfaces oscillated with the play of light and dark under the tree canopy, and it allowed us to incorporate a dim yellow-colored light that was reminiscent of the light in historic public spaces versus the largely parking lot light levels and color of the various public spaces that were being developed at the city at that time. This was the space soon after it was completed. It was activated and it was enjoyed by the neighborhood. It really became the center of the neighborhood. But I'm sad to say that the building was torn down and all of the trees were removed about 6 or 7 years ago. And now we were saddened by this, but it taught us a great lesson. The project, the Design District has developed, and now on this site you will find the Hermes building, basically. This is a much longer story that we could discuss later, but what we learned was that if you want to develop true public space in a city, it needs to be developed on public property, ideally, meaning government-owned or city-owned. Public space developed on private property is more precarious, and you stand the risk of losing it in time. And this is not to demean or to demonize the developer. He's an extraordinary individual, and he gave us an opportunity to do this. But as architects, I think it's something for us to keep in mind and maybe become almost activists for this. This is actually 2 images of the infill buildings that did remain and that have gone through multiple iterations. The latest of which is a beautiful mural by Damien Hirst. So this is a new Tiffany shop that inhabits the building, and he did, what we think is just a very evocative exterior to the buildings. But once again, this is probably the 3rd or 4th iteration that has lined the fabric building. And what we learned here is that architecture wants to withstand the test of time, and so how can our buildings have these integral forms that remain useful despite the changes in clients or in display? And so the colonnade, which is actively used in the district, becomes an asset, and the overall building has been occupied and sort of reclad. And so we're excited to see what the next version is, but I think it's something that we should keep in mind as we develop buildings in our young or even our more established cities. Excuse me. So we were a small practice that was starting to gain momentum, and then the Great Recession hit. And so like all architects, we were hit. Especially small design firms. And so what we learned there is if you want something that you don't have, you have to do something that you've never done. And so we were invited, let me see how I'm going to tell you the story while the video plays. We were invited to a workshop in Guatemala City. Neither one of us are from Guatemala. We had never visited Guatemala, but we took a chance to go out there. And I would highly encourage all of you, the students in the room, to take a risk. When opportunity knocks, especially for the architect, you must always take it, basically. And so we jumped on a plane, we went down to Guatemala, we had an amazing time drawing through a series of workshops, but we met some extraordinary clients, which about a year after that initial visit, called us up one day and asked us if we would be willing to design a corporate headquarters for a sugar mill. We said yes. We had never designed a corporate headquarters. We had never been to Escuintla, Guatemala, but we figured that we had been educated enough with enough experience that we would learn in doing. And that's essentially what we set out to do. So this is our version of a high-tech animation. And so it's the way in which we had to bring back and forth the products of the design firm to Guatemala to be able to present them to the client. And in a digital age, an age which is so powerful with so many tools at your disposal, what we have found is that the physical models in the office have always been turning points for us, because there is something magical about the physical model. It puts you in touch with the building. It's a miniaturized version of the building. It places the client within the project in ways that we have found very little drawings can. So this is a project which I will quickly walk you through. The brief asked, the issue with the project was that they had a series of departments all over the countryside, and they needed to coalesce in a single building. So this is a single building which is oriented due north-south and with the short elevations east-west. And that comes from our study of Mayan site plans, where these prominent buildings were typically sited north-south for the prevailing breezes, essentially. And so we wanted to create a singular building, but we didn't want the experience of the headquarters to end there. We wanted to extend that life into the development of a series of landscaped gardens that would allow for the company to extend their working environments towards the exterior. This is a plan of the building. From left to right, it has a hall. It has a great break in the building, which we'll describe in a minute, the collective space at the center, which houses about 300 people, and then a series of interlocking conference rooms and courtyards, which frame views both to the inside and to the exterior. So this is the main entry into the project, and the reason it was set there is because the site is located within an extraordinary landscape with views to volcanoes. And when you come from the Caribbean, where 6 inches is considered monumental in terms of a shift in topography, Going to Guatemala is a mind-blowing experience, you know? But this is a framed view of the entry of the building of the Volcán del Fuego, which is always active and sort of puts you in connection with your own mortality, I have to say. And so by cropping this expansive frame, we wanted to focus your attention on this element in the landscape, which is thousands of feet away, obviously, but which comes into the project. And then to the left is a mill, a kind of machine that we found on the site that had been thrown out, and we cleaned it up and set it on a pedestal, in part to objectify this early machine, which was part of the early workings of the mill, and so tie it to its own history, but also to allow you to witness the growth that the company had had. So this is a drawing of the building within the context of the landscape. And drawing, I think as Ashley pointed out, has always played a very important role in our work. Our love of drawing began during our undergraduate studies at the University of Miami in the 90s. And we really had the good fortune to be students at a moment where a number of like-minded individuals coalesced. Some names that perhaps some of you in the room might know, like Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg and Andres Duani, and the extraordinary architectural historian Vincent Scully, whom if you as a student have not read, I would highly recommend that you read his work. And others that are lesser known to you, but maybe even more important to us, which were architects, painters, artists, Teófilo Victoria, Roberto Béjar, George Hernandez, and Catherine Lin. Impressed by the pedagogical method that produced much of the drawings of the school at that time, Scully wrote in a book entitled Between Two Towers on the drawings of the School of Miami. He said the following: "The drawings of the School of Miami," and this is in the 90s, "are in my opinion much the most beautiful being produced at any school of architecture in the present time. They can be enjoyed as works of art in their own right." He spoke of how the drawings were done in the spirit of John Ruskin, who he believed drew from nature versus abstraction, and that was the greatest lesson for the architect. So our teachers, they taught us to see not just architecture, but its relationship to culture. They taught us to feel enthusiasm for the modest and to carefully draw the flora and the fauna of a place so as to build within us a sensibility of how the built and the natural environment were inextricably linked. Many of the drawings were strictly documentational, such as the plan of the Great Florida Alligator or the site of the Koreshan Unity Settlement in Central Florida. These efforts were often augmented by compositional drawings that were meant to reveal a narrative about the place, such as this drawing for the Miami International Airport. These sensibilities continue with us till this day and inform our drawings, be they analog, we still draw by hand in the office, or digital. We do a lot of digital work. So I come back to the MAG project. This is a drawing that we produced for that project, where it's a triptych, basically. That's that repetitive sequence that I showed you from the inner room. And you see the perfectly square opening that frames that timeless view of the Guatemalan landscape, and the two conference rooms to either side that conversely have no windows looking out, but look back into the collective space of the building. This is a sort of detail of that drawing where we painstakingly create hand-drawn details that are then scanned and layered into digital files, creating hybrid drawings where we don't really know where the hand starts and the digital begins, or vice versa. This is a section of the project, hierarchically showing the most important room in the building, and then a shot of that building soon after it was completed, before everybody moved in. It's really, it culminates in a vent at the top of the building, and because of its thinness, it basically doesn't need to have the lights on most of the day, and then hot air rises up and out of the building. So when you work in an environment like Escuintla or many of the sites that we work on, we don't really have the luxury to have enormous budgets, for instance. And so we always have to address the question of sustainability with the inherent form of the building. And any technologies that we can add are a plus added upon those foundational decisions. Here's a detail of the stair that also folds as an auditorium for outdoor or public lectures, not outdoor lectures, indoor lectures. And we also had the opportunity to design the objects, from the tables to eventually lamps, which are not in this view. These are other details of the base of the building, and also local woods that we used for the wood interiors of the conference rooms. Maybe this image describes the 3 layers of the building, the concrete, the stuccoed surfaces, and finally culminating in the metal roof that ends in that lantern. And then finally, I think that the project explored the idea of framing that landscape at a variety of scales and in a variety of ways. Sometimes at the level of the architectural element, such as this almost kind of nose-like window that projects out of the dining room, looking across to this volcano in the distance. Or finally, this horizontal framed outdoor cafeteria. This is not glass, this is completely outdoors, and it frames that, again, horizontal landscape that I've been discussing. This is a final view of the building upon completion, which always surprised us because it looked exactly like the model. This doesn't always happen, but it was beautiful to see it in the end. And the building has been used and was able to be used throughout the entire pandemic because the entire building can open up and cross-ventilate. That's a great lesson that we have learned in Latin America. We hermetically seal our buildings in America to the point that when anything happens, like a hurricane in Miami, which happens often, or in Latin America where there's a power outage, your buildings, you can't breathe. So this was the final iteration and really set the stage for a series of projects that I will briefly go through. We were in and out of Guatemala for about 3 years trying to execute this project, and we came across this school that was entirely run down. As a parent and as an architect, we felt the need to have to help. And so we partnered with a local non-for-profit, and we donated our services. Why? Because we felt we could, and so we must. And we also believe that architecture has the possibility of creating more dignified places for all, but we also believe that as educators, education is one way to, I don't want to say battle, but I think to confront the challenges of poverty. Of course, it's not the only way, but statistics have shown that a more educated population has a better chance of actually making a better life for themselves and their children. So we worked on this project. Suffice to say, it had to be incredibly cost efficient. So we developed an idea of a prototype, which is based on the basic size of the classroom, which could be configured a number of ways with outdoor spaces that could expand the life of the interior. This is an early sketch that we produced because we were blown away by this beautiful tree that was in the middle of the site, and so we wanted to create a kind of building that would frame that tree in a different way. This was a section of the prototype, which you can see maybe shares some of the reality or some of the considerations of the main building that we just showed you for the mill, which is served to elevate the building off of the ground. This is an area that gets flooded continuously, and then to create a building that is not air conditioned, so there is no glass in this building, so it's an architecture of screen of varying kinds with varying degrees of privacy. And then finally a very large sloping roof, which extends far beyond, nearly 2.5 meters to 3 meters beyond the building walls, and is bracketed back to the building. Of course, this offers an enormous amount of shade, but it also tends to double the size of the building because the depths of the corridors are no longer for circulation, but can be areas of congregation. This is a digital model we produced. I'm sorry, I was battling a cold for the last week, and so I'm going to be drinking more than I normally do. And then this is the building as it was, soon after it was completed. Here we see a detail. And then this is my favorite image of the building, I have to say, because it has this tiny little boy that is too young to go to school in these buildings, but his 3 brothers go to school here. And so he never came to the school before, but soon after the prototype was completed, he would sit under that shade. And I think he felt that it was a place that was designed, a place that had a certain degree of dignity, and I think that he was able to listen to his brother's classes from the outdoors. And so the fact that he sat there sort of joyful made the entire process worthwhile. And so I think as architects, if you have the opportunity to work with communities like these, to make these environments, I think better, we owe it really to the universe to do it. I think this is the final image of this project. It's the end of the building where you can see it sort of in use, with the outdoors being used as kind of impromptu classrooms. And I'm happy to say that after this was built, the school was able to double its student enrollment, and so hopefully be able to accomplish the mission of teaching these rural populations, which are currently underserved. A few more things about Guatemala. These early projects allowed us to expand our work in the city, having been working there now for a couple of years. And contrary to the third world reputation among NGOs and missionaries, Guatemala is now considered a middle-income country. And barring a political catastrophe, which is altogether possible in Latin America and Central America, unfortunately, I'm Latin American, so I can say this, Guatemala will continue to grow in the decades to come. Levels of extreme poverty are declining, and the fertility rate is also falling, which typically accompanies growth to access in education. Guatemala's GDP per capita has also grown steadily over the past 60 years, and these statistics come from a variety of sources, most notably the World Bank, and are supported by a rise of population to urban areas and the greater need for housing. So because of this growth in the urban centers, we were challenged to do a series of housing proposals, which I will briefly describe here, at least the central ideas behind them. This is the first project that we engaged housing at a larger scale, and we confronted an urban pattern that typically looked like the top left image. So it's an independent building surrounded by a sea of parking. So what we tried to do was challenge these conditions, and we wanted to break up the building in order to avoid these long, dark corridors on the interior. And then we wanted to redistribute parking, tucking some of it underneath the building so that it would open up more of the ground for green space, and finally create a kind of collection of green areas, be it between the buildings, on top of the buildings, or at the edges of the parcel. This is a rendering that attempts to show that. This is the type that we developed. It was very interesting because in Latin America, while these are apartments, there is still this idea that the house is much preferred to the apartment, and the idea of having party wall units becomes challenging, especially for the developers that we were working with. And so we developed this idea of this H plan where we split apart the apartments and introduce a pretty generous circulation at the center. And this was important for us because today, I don't know if this happens to all of you, you enter most buildings, certainly in America, but even throughout Latin America, you come in and it's hard for you to find the stair. Well, not in this building. No, in this building is fabulous this way. But in most buildings, you know, and so you're required to take an elevator even if it's only up to a second floor. So our thought was, how can we use circulation, compressing it at the center of the plan so that it becomes a space that is activated and utilized in a place where people can gather. And so we were fortunate enough to be able to develop that. This is one of the apartments. These apartments are not large apartments. They're about 1,000 square feet. But they provide a kind of layered view from the interior to the exterior, again surrounded by this beautiful landscape that defines Guatemala. This was that stair that I was talking about earlier, and the building just prior to being completed that shows the individual units and the desire to carve out a central courtyard that would in time become lushly landscaped. The interiors, while modest, we were very preoccupied with the way in which the individual units would be designed. And so we explored the idea of large windows, which is something we learned in our trips to Tokyo. Tokyo has extremely small apartments, but typically utilize very large windows. And that sharp contrast permits small spaces to feel much more expansive. Soon after that project, we were commissioned to do the second project, and it happened to be during the pandemic. And as in other parts of the world, the pandemic impacted the global supply chains of concrete and reinforced steel. This reality led us to explore alternative methods in construction, namely brick, which had been extensively used in Guatemala during the 1980s, but had diminished in the years following. So in this particular case, we designed a prototype for an individual house that is 5.5 meters wide. And in this particular case, we are not in a dense city center. We're still in a sort of suburban enclave. And so we were aware that most people would arrive here by car. But what we wanted to do is once you arrived at the property, we wanted to actually take some of the requirements that the clients had given us and figure out if there were ways that we could arrange the community so that there was a greater desire for a kind of collective space of gathering. And so we took all the small requirements that are typically displaced over these lots and gathered them at the center of the plan to develop an open space that could be enjoyed by the residents. And then we developed a type that could change both in facade and also in the coloration of the brick to provide variety. Because as you know, urban housing has the challenge of being repetitive, but at the same time needs to provide enough variety to provide a certain degree of individual attention to the various units. So here you see the prototype, the first prototype that was built. This is a view of the space, of the central space. A few of the plans. We still believe in the art of making plans. I think James Ackerman, the historian, spoke about the plan being the generator of a work of architecture. But we have found that in housing, this is particularly poignant, particularly in small housing, because every inch matters. So this is an outdoor space off of the main living room, seen once the prototype was built, and also seen directly from the main living space. This idea of layering the spaces that move out towards the exterior. We had the good fortune of working entirely in brick, so we were able to explore ways to configure both the ground, the benches, and even the walls, so that in time this housing would have the ability to weather gracefully. This was a sectional drawing where we explored the addition of offices at the ground level, which became very popular during the pandemic, that could spill out into individual gardens that were then alongside the collective spaces. This is a side elevation, which happens only a few times in the project, where one could become more picturesque in assigning the locations of the windows as opposed to the more rational fronts of the prototypes. And finally, the use of ornament in these buildings, the sort of decorative elements, how we could move the brick to reflect the light. And this was something that was really poignant for us in Guatemala, because when in Guatemala, the light is almost always directly overhead. So with very little projections on surfaces, you can get pretty dramatic shadows. So we tapped into that tradition to see whether the tops of the buildings could be slightly crenellated to produce more dramatic plays of light and dark. And finally, this is maybe the most ambitious project. It's just breaking ground now, and it's a tower in the heart of the city. And this has been challenging in so many ways, but excuse me. But suffice to say, the principal ideas here was to create, excuse me, a compact floor plan, eliminating the need for the corridor type, and producing 4 units on every floor that would culminate in a figured skyline, as opposed to just an extruded rectangle. This was important for us because we have a kind of love affair with the figured towers and the way that they meet the sky. So how could we design a contemporary tower that would also figure itself against the skyline, utilizing key elements that would sort of register both the figure urbanistically and also architecturally. So the repetitive arches, which draw on a number of traditions, including the Spanish, but even to a certain degree the Mayan, compose the facades. And so they are similar, behind which lie an infinite number of variations of domestic life, and of course the ever-present view of the volcano in the distance. This is a final image of this project with the idea of this figured tower set against, of course here, a neutral backdrop, but certainly in the case of the skyline of the city of Guatemala, will figure itself in sharp contrast to many of the glass skyscrapers. I'm going to end briefly with these three last projects, and I won't take very much longer, but just to show that at every turn, one is continuously searching for new directions, whether that be in school or whether that be in practice. And the pandemic was another one of these pivotal moments for us. Like all of you, we actually had the good fortune of being part of the creative class, where we could be at home earning our living through designing and through teaching. But what became poignant for us, was that the home became the center of our world. And again, we were fortunate enough to live in a place where we could operate Zoom crits for studios. We could offer practice, all of the Zoom, was handled, all of the practice was handled to Zoom. Our son could actually do all of his schoolwork on another computer, and we were far enough apart from one another that we could actually, the home worked for us. But as a result, we started exiting into the city and really learning more about the place that we call home, and realizing that so much of our own city was not like that. Home was really a less than desirable place for many. So what did we do? We launched a number of initiatives. I started this online lecture series. At the time, I was the director of the undergraduate program because I was going crazy in my house. And I thought to myself, I need to connect with as many people as I can out there, and I want to hear what they have to say about where are they and how is the pandemic affecting them, and how do they feel that the pandemic will affect architecture in the long run. And then this slowly emerged into an online radio program. So if any of you are interested, you can find me on Spotify or on Apple iTunes. It's called On Cities. And I've tried to interview a number of individuals that I believe can contribute to the conversation of the ways in which architecture and cities are inextricably linked, and that I truly believe that cities are the greatest legacy that we leave to the future generation. And whether your interventions are small or large, they can make an enormous difference in the way in people live in the built environment. And so simultaneously, we started researching our own cities to try to catalog a number of vernacular examples that we thought were important. But more importantly, for the sake of this lecture, we've engaged in a new line of work for us, and perhaps because of the housing projects that we had been developing in Guatemala, we now had a more robust portfolio of work to be able to go after work in the United States. And so we started calling up everybody we knew, and we said, listen, we want to work on housing projects in the city. We want to work at this intermediate scale, because Miami essentially works at the two scales. We have the detached, large scale, single family residential at this end, and pretty much the high rise tower at the other end. There's almost nothing in between. This occurs for a whole host of reasons, but we felt that we could make an inroad in that middle ground. And so we started working on three projects. This one is in Liberty City. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood that occurs west of the highway on higher ground. And these neighborhoods are currently being gentrified for a number of reasons, because of economic pressures, of Miami's desirability, but also because they occur now on higher ground. So they're experiencing climate gentrification, people moving away from the coast and moving further in. This, this is a sort of typical image from about a decade ago, where you see much of what Liberty City looked like. Our site is right along Martin Luther King Drive. These are some images of Liberty City, where we always scope the neighborhood. So before we do any project, we spend days walking the neighborhoods in which we work, looking at it through the lens of an architect, essentially, and looking at the realities of the place. And so most of the typologies that line Martin Luther look something like this, and it has some serious challenges. One of them is that the central courtyard, as you can see, is lined with a stair. And that stair is the public circulation for the building. And so housing generally wants privacy. And so what happens, since the public circulation is on the front of the buildings where the entries to the apartments are, all of those windows end up becoming very, very small. So these spaces end up being quite dark and inhospitable. Not solely because of the type, obviously, there are economic realities that also weigh into this, but the form of the buildings also helps support that. But you also find moments of extraordinary beauty nearby, these kind of tiled surfaces of the Bacardi building, or even these local colors and these tiles that you find on many of the streets in Liberty City. So we collaged that. We started with the sketch, which we normally do, and we were tasked with doing a 20-unit building for Hope House, which is an organization out of New York City. It's an extraordinary organization that is meant to provide transitional housing for formerly incarcerated women. And what we learned is that Miami has the highest rate of incarcerated women in the country, particularly minority women. And this is not a surprise, because Miami's demographics, are largely Latin. We have a very large Black community, and so it's not surprising that our city would have this. But we were commissioned to do the first project, and we were working on a 50 by 100-foot lot, very dense lot, that wanted to produce about a 16 to 20 unit building. I say that it's a dense lot because it's not dense right now, but the city's codes have dramatically changed. So eventually, over time, our building will become an infill building. But for the time being, it will likely stay as a kind of freestanding building. So I'll just quickly walk you through the intentions of the project paired with perspectives. The ground level has a micro retail that basically screens the parking. Seems pretty straightforward, but doesn't often get done in Miami and other cities that we visited. And what happens when that doesn't happen is that you break down the continuity of the street and the experience for the pedestrian. That micro retail is also part of Hope House's mission to make the women that will live here also economically solvent and viable. So they employ the women to work in the shop as well. So I think it performs an architectural role, but also a social one. The upstairs, while seemingly straightforward, became a kind of act in fighting against the types that we saw, in part because of its relationship between the interior and the corridor. So in essence, what we did is we produced 6 units that you see here, and we tried to place ourselves within the building and try to design even the smallest of units to be places where we would want to live if we had to live here. And so 2 of the units face the street, 2 of the units face the court, and 2 of the units face the rear. But by placing the corridor on the opposite from the courtyard, we lined all the services of the apartments along that, allowing for all of the major spaces of the building to open up into the courtyard, producing interiors that look more like this, with very, very large windows that maximize light and a connection to a landscaped court in the center. This drawing, entitled Angels in the Architecture, and for any of you who are fans of Renaissance paintings or Mantegna, we borrowed the angels of Mantegna up at the top of that. I think it was Picasso that used to say every artist is a thief, the greater the artist, the greater the thief. And so pining through the art books, they occupy there. And this is the kind of carved courtyard at the back of the property that essentially is perhaps the least desirable of the units, but we wanted to provide them with a unique court that, again, would give them the same benefits as those that were living at the front of the building or that were facing the larger court at the center. This is a folded down, developed surface drawing on the right, and then an oblique, because while this building in time will become an infill building, for a very long time it will remain as a kind of object, and so we've sculpted the side elevation as opposed to leaving it as a blank wall. This project, which I'm happy to say is under construction, is happening in Overtown. Overtown is another one of these extraordinary neighborhoods. It was a vibrant, predominantly Black neighborhood before the 1950s. And as all of you, or many of you know, the great highway acts of the 1950s crisscrossed through so many American cities, and most of them crisscrossed through the lower income neighborhoods, be it Black or Hispanic. Overtown really got hit doubly hard because it got 2 of the highways crisscrossing it. So essentially it severed that neighborhood and it was never able to recover. Today, like Liberty City, this neighborhood is being developed because it's in an optimal place in the city, just west of the downtown. Our project takes place on what is regarded as a throwaway site. Let me see if I can articulate that. The typical lot in Miami is 5,000 square feet. Most people feel that they can only build a single family residential on a 5,000 square foot. This is a 3,500 square foot site where we now have a 4-story building for Catalyst Miami, which is a non-for-profit organization that is rooted in Overtown and is a grassroots non-for-profit that is meant to service the community. They were going to be displaced, but through an extraordinary developer that we're working with and some extraordinary negotiations with the city, they've been able to do all the kinds of things to be able to develop that site, which under most conditions would have been rendered, again, a sort of throwaway site. Two leading preoccupations for this building, I would say, is the development of a courtyard urban type that would permit the building to cross-ventilate and to receive natural daylight for the majority of the day. But also because once the city builds up around it, the only thing that will remain for this building will be the front elevation. And so the front elevation became an investigation of the grid, and it was a gridded elevation that was composed to be able to read as almost kind of a billboard for the building. This is the building as an axonometric, and once again, a kind of developed surface drawing that we like to do to kind of make a two-dimensional drawing feel three-dimensional. And finally, a view of the upper story where you see the surrounding neighborhoods and the adjacent highway, which persists but is now being elevated so that the city can continue underneath it. So this particular project is very important to us for a number of reasons. One, because it takes the lessons of our many travels throughout the world where cities like Tokyo, for instance, develop a mid-scale architecture on much smaller parcels of land. And if we could do this more systematically, we could develop neighborhoods that in fact have a greater number of uses, promote pedestrian activity, and really foster a kind of the patchwork of neighborhoods that really has defined Miami to this time. So this is a model of the building seen here, and I guess hopefully if I ever get a chance to come back, maybe we could show you some pictures of the final project. And then this last project is really just on the boards, and I share it because it again happens in another one of these neighborhoods which is experiencing massive change. And we were tasked with the ability to think at the level not of an individual building, but of a half block. And so we worked on the possibility of thinking about a tropical urbanism. And what we mean by that is that we proposed to the developers to be able to do a collection of small buildings seen here in black, right, with a series of interspersed courtyards, because there were a number of beautiful trees on the lot that we wanted to preserve, and they happened to fall kind of within those general areas. And by doing that, we thought that we could produce a syncopated rhythm of buildings at this kind of intermediate scale alongside these open courts that would give you a rhythm of landscape and building that is not often seen in a place like Miami, but could be explored because we, after all, are living in a tropical environment where stairs could be externalized, where surfaces can be tiled and weather beautifully against the daylight, and where buildings can remain relatively thin so that they can indeed open themselves up to the breezes, which do happen beautifully in Miami, and naturally cross-ventilate and are well lit. In this particular case, we explore color as we do in many of our projects. We are not afraid of embracing color, despite the kind of prevalence of a kind of white and gray palette that seems to have taken over much of our contemporary city. But we feel that there's a strong tradition, not just in Miami, but throughout Latin America, of the use of color, and we embrace it to try to augment the architectural ideas and set itself against the beautiful landscape that defines our region. So maybe in closing, I would like to say that for us, architecture is inextricably linked to the building of cities. We seek to create projects that address utility, but hopefully we aspire to delight. And in so doing, we hope that these buildings may have the greatest potential to persist in time and space and memory, blurring the lines between the old and the new. Thank you so much.